Well, good morning. I'd like to welcome you all to Session 1 of the 6-session webinar series, Redefining Airmanship. And I'm Dave Cook. Glad you could join me this morning. A little bit of orientation here if you haven't been to a GoToWebinar before. You should have on the right-hand side of your screen a control panel. And the little orange arrow there, you can click on that to minimize the size of the control panel and then click on it again to expand it. If you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand by clicking on the little hand there. And I'll see it here on my control panel. And then I can unmute your mic. If you want to ask a question via text, you can just type it in this box and then press the send button. And I'll see it over here. And then I can get to your question when we have a minute or two. Well, this is Session 1, as I mentioned, and in this session we're going to talk about why airmanship development now. We're going to talk about the roots and essence of airmanship. Airmanship defined, we'll come up with a shared definition. We'll look at Tony Kern's airmanship model. Now, as I'm sure you've already noticed, this is a PowerPoint presentation. Now, I know that about 50% of you love PowerPoint presentations, but the other 53% hate them. So I apologize to you if you fall into that 53% category. This is a Wings Program seminar, so you get 1 knowledge credit for attending the seminar today, and I can see who's logged in, and I will then be able to confirm with the FAA at faasafety.gov that you're attending the meeting, and you will get credit for it. As you know, the FAA Safety Team, or FAST Team's mission is to improve aviation safety. And they're doing that by conveying safety principles and practices through seminars and other communications means. They're a sponsor of the webinar. The other webinar sponsor is the Center for Airmanship Excellence. The Center for Airmanship Excellence, its purpose is the promotion of airmanship excellence and the expansion of airmanship education among existing and potential new pilots. The Center for Airmanship Excellence is a web-based resource for pilots who are pursuing airmanship excellence. And you can see here some of those resources. It's a portal to Captain Dave's Hangar, which is my blog on airmanship. You can also access the Airmanship Excellence Assessment Questionnaire, and we'll talk a lot about that a little later in the seminar series. You can also find out about airmanship excellence events that we hold. We've had 2 so far. We're planning more. And you can access the Airmanship Excellence archives. And for example, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available through the archives. You can also register for airmanship updates at the website just by entering your email address. The website address, airmanshipexcellence.org. Now, this webinar series is primarily based on the book Redefining Airmanship that was written by Dr. / Colonel Tony Kern, and it was published in 1997. Those of us who have read this book or involved in this program think that Dr. Kern has really gotten it right in providing us with a framework for talking about airmanship and also a resource for looking at the details of airmanship. Here's Dr. Kern's bio. He's a retired U.S. Air Force command pilot, former professor of military history at the U.S. Air Force Academy. He's actually the author of 5 books on pilot performance, excuse me, including Redefining Airmanship, Flight Discipline, and Darker Shades of Blue, The Rogue Pilot. He has a master's degree in public administration and military history, and a doctorate in higher education, specializing in human factors training design. So again, as his credentials indicate, he knows his stuff when it comes to airmanship. I have about 18,000 hours, maybe closer to 20. I quit counting a while back. I was a pilot for United Airlines for 22 years. During the time I was flying for United, I also flew for the U.S. Army National Guard as a rotary wing aviator for about 10 years. I was another life of mine. I was a Flight Safety International Simulator instructor and Training Center evaluator for about 4 years. And that was on the Challenger. I was a corporate pilot and charter pilot altogether for about 6 years. Fast team representative now for about a year. I've been a general aviation pilot for 48 years plus, and 45 of those years I've been a CFI airplane and instruments. I'm also an advanced instrument and ground instructor. I'm currently a simulator and ground instructor at Glass Simulator Center in Aurora, at Aurora Airport, and I primarily give recurrent and initial training on high performance singles and twins in the simulators at Glass. I'm the co-author of the book False Security, The Real Story About Airline Safety. I'm the managing trustee of the Aerospace Trust, and I'm the executive director of the Center for Airmanship Excellence. Now, these bullet points that are highlighted here are my background, really, or shows where I have the background in airmanship development, safety cultures, and safety management systems. So I don't have just book learning on what we're going to be talking about in the seminar series. I've actually been involved in it one way or another, either helping to develop these programs, helping to implement the programs, or operating within the programs over the course of my career. Now I'd like to find out a little bit about you, and I'm going to open up a poll question here, and stand by one while I do this. Here's the first question, and what I'd like to know is what kind of pilot certificate you have. So if you would just click on the button by the type of pilot certificate you hold and then submit it. Okay, I can see that 67% of you are private pilots and 33% of you hold instrument ratings. So I assume that if you didn't click on private, commercial, or ATP, that you're a student pilot or you don't currently hold any pilot certificates. Now I'd like to see how many hours you have. So if you would just click the appropriate button, so we can get an idea of how many hours we all have here. So 57% of you have logged in your time. 71. Okay, so about 20% of you have less than 200 hours, and then about another 20% have 200 to 500. Half of you have between 500 and 1,000, and about 20% of you have between 1,000 and 5,000 hours. So on average, how many hours a month do you fly? And this is just a rough average, trying to get an idea of how current you are and how often you fly, and you'll see why a little bit later. We're going to talk about that. So we're standing by for give you all of a chance here to log in your data. So it looks like about half of you are flying less than 4 hours a month, which is, by the way, pretty typical for the folks that have been attending these webinars or the seminar series that were the predecessor to this webinar series. And about half of you are flying between 4 to 10 hours a month, and no one is showing flying more than 10 hours a month. Now here's a question that may not seem too relevant to you right now, but you'll see as we go through this why I'm asking this question. So how many of you have a formal flight proficiency program now? That means a plan that's written out and a plan that you follow, not just something you're keeping in mind that you might want to do for flight proficiency. So it looks like about all of you don't have a formal program, and I'm hoping that as we go through the seminar series here, the webinar series, I'm sorry, that you will change your ways and set up a formal plan. I just have a couple more questions for you. First one is, if you're instrument rated, do you maintain your instrument proficiency? Do you fly your 6 approaches, intercept a course, and hold, log those every 6 months? Oh, great. 100% of you so far. Only 38% have logged their data, but 100% so far say they do maintain proficiency. I'm sorry, currency. Okay. And one final question. If you're a VFR-only pilot, do you have a formal proficiency management program? In other words, you take recurrent training at least 3 times a year, and that's formal recurrent training in a simulator or an airplane with an instructor with a plan, not just going up and flying around. So about 50% of you have logged your data. Give you a few more seconds here to input your answer if you're so inclined. All right, it looks like about 20% of you do maintain a formal proficiency program, currency program, and about 60% of you don't. Well, great. Well, thank you for answering those questions. That helps me to know a little bit better about where you're at right now. And of course, way at the end of this webinar series, there'll be an exit survey, and we'll ask those and other questions again. All right, well, let's move on. This webinar series will help you to answer the question, if I don't fly right, should I fly at all? I know that's a pretty strong statement, saying if I'm not going to do everything right that I should do to be a proficient airman, should I even go up and fly at all? Of course, other than regaining that proficiency. And I think by the time we get to the end of this webinar series, you'll have a good answer to that question. Well, let's talk about why we're even talking about airmanship now. Over the past several decades, 4 or 5 decades, well over tens of millions of dollars and a lot of effort has been spent by the FAA, AOPA, a lot of other organizations trying to improve the general aviation accident record. But despite all that effort and all that money, the general aviation safety record has been virtually unchanged over that time, over the last 4 or 5 decades. However, the military, airlines, and charter operators have significantly improved their safety record, and we're going to look at why that is. Pilot error accounts for over 80% of all accidents, either as a root cause or as the direct cause of the accident. But we don't like to make errors. None of us do. Our personalities are counter error. We don't like to do it. We have all of our training is focused on not making errors, but we still make errors. However, at the airlines and the charter operators, efforts to reduce pilot error have really worked. They've worked well, as you'll see here in a few minutes as we look at the data. So the airlines have improved, the military and charter operators, by applying some techniques, procedures, systems that we'll look at. Let's take a look at this accident rates and we'll compare them. The general aviation accident rate is 38 times worse than the airlines. Now, I'm sure you've noticed that Airbus A3 there in the middle, that's just the new shorter version of the A380. General aviation accident rate is 4 times worse than charter operators. The logic of applying the best practices that are used by the military, the airlines, and charter operators to personal flying is this. As I stated, 80% of accidents are caused by pilot error. We don't want to make pilot errors. Best practices have been affected in professional flight operations to reduce those errors. So we believe that by applying those best practices to personal flying, we can be much, much safer. Here's the aviation accident rates per 100,000 hours flown for general aviation, charter, and airlines. Top line there, green is general aviation, red is charter, and the amber is airlines. You can see here in 1990, the general aviation accident rate was 7.85 accidents per 100,000 hours flown. By 2009, it was 7.2. So there's a reduction, but if you stretched out this chart, made it a little wider, that line would look virtually flat, and in fact, it has been virtually flat. However, at the charter operators, you can see in 1990, they had 4.76 accidents per 100,000 hours, and by 2009, it had reduced significantly to 1.63. And the thing to look at on this chart is that hang on just one second, I noticed we might have a glitch here. Okay, I'm going to open up John Munson's mic. John, your mic is open. You there? Okay, let's try Julie. Julie, are you there? Okay, I'm going to take off. There's John Munson. John, are you there, John? Okay, stand by just a second. We're having some technical difficulty here. Let me see if I can fix it. There we go. Julie, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, yeah, I can hear you. Do you have the PowerPoint presentation on your screen?
No, the PowerPoint presentation isn't displaying. It just the telephone number to call in.
Okay. This is only the second webinar I've done. The first one went off without a hitch, and I'm not really sure why we're having this difficulty. Let me try something here.
Okay, now it's showing, David.
Now it's showing. Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to mute you all again if you don't mind, but if you do have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. John, I've got you unmuted. Did you have another question? Okay. Julie, I'm going to leave you unmuted if you don't mind. If you see another problem on your end, please let me know.
Okay, I will.
Good. Now, did you guys get, Julie, did you hear the explanation of the aviation accident rates?
Yes, we did hear them.
Okay, great. Now, the thing to look at on this accident rates for charter operations is that in 1990, that was about the time that the FAA decided to start pushing some of these safety management systems and safety cultures that we're going to talk about later. And you can see that those techniques brought the accident rate down significantly. And the charter operators have been continuing to use those techniques, and they've made this major reduction in their accident rate. The airlines, you can see, are flat through the 90s and up until 2009. Very low accident rate, only about 0.15 accidents, 0.17 accidents per 100,000 hours in 90 and 0.15 now. And I was with United in the early 80s, and that was where we started introducing safety culture or safety management systems. And you can, so I'm trying to get the data out of the FAA right now. They've got it hidden, locked away someplace on the airline accident rate back in the 80s. But I believe that it was up significantly before those techniques were applied to the airlines. But certainly by the 90s, they were well into effect, and you can see that they worked at the airlines. And we'll talk about what those techniques and procedures were here. So right now, general aviation faces this four great challenge, and that's another reason why we're talking about airmanship. The general aviation safety record, and we just talked about, that's a big challenge. The lack of new pilots coming into aviation is a big challenge. The dwindling number of current pilots, most of us are getting up there in age, and the numbers are falling, and we'll look at that specifically here in a second. And the declining flight activity. So these challenges facing general aviation could have a significant impact that we're going to look at here in a second. Here's the numbers on student starts. This is the decade of the 70s. You can see in 1970 there were 127,000 new student starts every year. Mid-70s about 114,000 a year. By the end of the decade 136,000 student starts a year. That was an average of 136,000 student starts a year through the 70s. In the 80s, remember we ended with about 136,000 student starts in 79. 1980 it dropped off to 102, took a little bump up to 120, dropped off to 86, and by the end of the 80s we were down to an average of 87,000 student starts a year. In the 90s, started out with 89,000. In 90, low point was 57,000. We ended up 1999 with less than 58,000 student starts a year. That's an average of 68,000 across the decade. Then from 2000 to 2009, we started out with 58,000. Low point was less than 54. High point was only 67, and we ended up in 2009 with less than 55,000. The average across that decade was only about 60,000 student starts a year. So if we look at that across those 4 decades, in the 70s, 136,000 a year, 80s, 87,000 a year, the 90s, 68,000, and 2000s, 60,000. So that's a pretty steep decline, and the trend line is down. The FAA just a few months ago indicated that it was going to be probably under 50,000 student starts in 2010. So we're still dropping the number of student starts every year. Here's another shocking statistic. Of the 60,000 student starts each year, only 20% complete their private pilot training. So that's only 13,000 new private pilots a year. Very low number. Let's look at the declining active pilots, number of active pilots. Now the FAA defines an active pilot, and that's what these numbers are that we're going to look at, as a pilot who holds a current medical. Doesn't really mean you're flying, just that you have a current medical. In 1980 there were 850,000 active pilots. In 2010 we're down to 620,000, and I've heard rumors that they're going to revise that number to under 600,000. But using that 620 figure, that's 230,000, 250,000 fewer pilots. 27% decline. But as shocking as those numbers are, I think they're really even worse. Now these numbers I'm going to show you on the right are strictly our numbers, our assumptions, and it's based on the people we've been talking to for the last year that are quote-unquote active pilots. And what we recall from the 80s is that of those 850,000 active pilots in the 80s, about 80% of them were flying 4 or 5 or more hours a month. And if you were flying then, you probably think back that you were doing a lot more flying in the 80s than you're doing now. Well, if that number is true, 680,000, then the 210 active pilots, we think it's only about 20% of the 620. Now that's based on surveys that we've been doing at the seminar series called Redefining Airmanship that we held across the Chicago area over the summer. We think that's pretty accurate. About 20% of us are active pilots, meaning flying more than 5 hours a month right now. That's only 124,000 pilots. That means there's over 500,000 fewer really active pilots, pilots who fly frequently. That's an 82% decline. So if those numbers on the right are anywhere near accurate, we've had a major decline in the activity among current pilots. This is directly shown, though, in the decline in flight hours from 1980 to 2010. In 1980, all piston hours equaled 35 million hours in that year. But by 2009, the piston hours flown had fallen to 14 million. That's a 60% decline. In the good old days, there were 12,000 FBOs, and by the good old days, I mean the 80s. And the airframers out there in Wichita were producing about 18,000 single-engine pistons a year. Now, however, we're down to 4,000 FBOs, and we're still losing about 10% a year. Piston singles sold last year were 1,600. That's, of course, part of that is due to the recession, but even back in 2007-8, there were only about 2,600 piston singles produced each year in the U.S. So again, significant decline. So the only question, at least in my mind, is this going to be a continuous decline? It might be a little steeper, a little flatter, but we end up in the same place, just a different year. And will general aviation or personal flying end with a whimper? And because we're all just sitting around saying, what, me worry? Or are we going to go over a cliff? And it will end with a bang, and then we'll all be sitting around thinking, what happened? I think the general aviation pilot's operating handbook ought to include this warning. In any business, any industry, the customer base has to be of sufficient size to support the infrastructure that supports that customer base. And I don't know what that number is of active pilots or hours flown, but we're going there rapidly, and I think it could be a time in the not too distant future where there are just not enough of us participating, and most, if not all, of the FBO support and manufacturing support, so forth, for our personal flying goes away. So, is airmanship development the answer? That's the question we want to address next. In terms of the general aviation safety record, we know that more proficient airmen have fewer accidents. And we know, or we believe, that applying airmanship best safety practices to GA should equal fewer accidents. So we think that airmanship development, which we're going to talk about from here on out, really can affect the safety record significantly. The lack of new student starts. Can airmanship development help that? Well, airmanship framework provides a clear path to safety for new pilots. And I've been talking to a lot of people over the last few years that have thought about learning to fly but have not yet taken the plunge. And either they or their spouses are concerned about these dangerous little airplanes. And that, of course, provides a barrier to entry for these new pilots. If we can improve that general aviation safety record significantly, we should be able to lower that barrier and get new pilots coming in. That's only one of the factors in bringing in new pilots, of course, but we think it's a big factor. How about the lack of student starts? Airmanship development provides a flight plan for learning to fly expertly. I've talked to many pilots, people who have gotten their private pilot license or been on their way to their private, and they've gotten in a situation where they've been scared and they've stopped flying. In fact, my nephew was one of those people, and they just won't fly anymore because they scared themselves. Well, if we have consistent, continuous, effective airmanship development for everyone, then we can hopefully get more students to start. And of course, the old adage about that $100 hamburger might be the only challenge left for personal flying. We believe, though, the continuous evolving challenges meet new pilots' expectations. And if they can see a plan, a clear path on how they can continue to have the excitement of meeting challenges and the satisfaction of meeting challenges, that will entice them to learn to fly. How about the rapidly dwindling number and declining flight activity of current pilots? Can airmanship development help that? Well, as I just mentioned, airmanship development provides new challenges. Most of the time we get a private license, and then maybe we're thinking about the instrument rating, and then a little later we pursue the instrument rating. But then what's after that? There are things that we can do, but they're not laid out in a clear plan that actually has small bites to it. Yeah, that's a big jump between a private certificate and an instrument rating. There should be, we believe, many challenges to develop airmanship in between. It'll keep everybody interested. Of course, airmanship development drives increased flight activity because you need to fly more if you're going to be developing your airmanship skills. Also, we all complain about the cost of flying being so high. Our analysis tells us that if we consolidate airmanship development flight hour demand, we can significantly reduce the cost of flying. And by that I mean we can put out a new glass cockpit airplane for $89 an hour wet. I know that sounds unbelievable, but we know what we're talking about. We've been in the business a long time, and there is not just me saying this. There's a lot of other experienced folks that have looked at this, and we believe we can reduce that cost significantly by aggregating the demand. And we'll talk more about that later in the series. So that's why airmanship now. And that's why we're going out with this webinar series. We had the seminar series, and we're doing other things to see if we can generate interest among the current pilots for airmanship development. Let's look now at the roots and essence of airmanship. Almost every aviation history or learn to fly book starts out with the myth of Daedalus and Icarus. And I'm sure you remember, Icarus and Daedalus were trying to escape from an island, and they fashioned wings made of wax and feathers. And Icarus, the sun, had a little hubris, and he decided he was going to fly close to the sun, and his wax melted, the feathers came off, and he crashed. Well, that's really also a source story for airmanship, because airmanship requires an integrated understanding of your flying mechanism, and Icarus certainly didn't have a good understanding of his flying mechanism. It also requires a good understanding of your teammates. If Icarus would have listened to his father, he wouldn't have flown so close to the sun. He would have known his father knew what he was talking about. Flying is an immensely hostile environment. When I went through Army helicopter school, my instructor had 2 tours in Vietnam as a scout helicopter pilot. And if you know anything about those guys, they were pretty gutsy guys. They took these little helicopters and flew them down around the jungle and tried to get the enemy to shoot at them so the gunships could come in. This guy knew how to fly helicopters, and he always told me over and over, Dave, anytime you get more than 10 feet off the ground and or start moving more than 10 knots over the ground, you are subject to severe bodily harm up to and including death. We operate in a hostile environment. The sky is a hostile environment. And we have to know about ourselves. And if Icarus had known a little bit more about himself, he would have had that ego in check, and he wouldn't have flown so close to the sun. So we go all the way back to the source myth, if you will, for airmanship, and it tracks along with what we're going to talk about here. Also, then we come to the Wright brothers. And the Wright brothers had a knowledge of their aircraft, obviously. They designed it and built it. They had a good understanding of each other. They knew their environment that they were flying in, and they knew themselves individually, their strengths and weaknesses. So the Wright brothers were really a part of this development or evolution of airmanship. Then we had the early pioneers, the air racers, the barnstormers, those folks. And they got into planning, knowledge of their environment, their aircraft, and discipline, which is a big part of airmanship. And they really started writing that stuff down and passing it along. So they were a big part of the evolution of airmanship. Then in World War I, though, the military started formalizing things. And they started seeing aviators or complete airmen. They were seen as disciplined, skilled and proficient, possessing an understanding of their aircraft, themselves, their teammates, their environment, and their risks. Then in World War II, we started looking at airmanship a little bit differently. We decided that discipline, skill, proficiency, and knowledge yield situational awareness and good judgment. And that's what we talk a lot about now, is situational awareness and good judgment. And that's really what Kern calls the capstone outcomes of airmanship. And we'll look at those in detail here in just a little bit. And of course now, at the professional organizations, there's a continuous formal airmanship development supported by a safety culture and safety management systems. So that's kind of a quick overview of how airmanship has evolved over the years. Now let's see if we can define airmanship. Kern says there's no shared definition of airmanship. Webster's, right out of the dictionary, says skill in piloting or navigating aircraft. We know it when we see it, but we really don't have a shared definition of airmanship. Let's see if we can get to that. So let me ask, if you go to your questions, that box down there on the lower right, and if you have any quick ideas of what airmanship is to you right now, I'd appreciate it if you'd give me a quick answer to that question. What do you think airmanship is? Nobody willing to venture a guess, huh? Or an opinion. Don't forget to hit the send button after you type it in. Well, I'm giving you a little bit of time to answer that question. I have another question up here. When will the seminar recording be available? The answer to that question is by the end of this coming week. Okay, well, that's not atypical. When we have the live seminars, I ask this question, and nobody really has a clear idea in their mind as to what airmanship is. So let's see if we can come to a shared definition. Expert aviators are said to have good hands, judgment, good discipline, common sense, situational awareness. That's one way to look at what airmanship is. We know that there's an unofficial hierarchy to airmanship, but most of us are unsure of how to advance within that hierarchy unless you're in a professional organization like a airline where it's clear path up to captain and then senior captain. This pyramid of professionalism, as Kern calls it, defines our prowess as aviators. So let's see if we can agree on this shared definition of airmanship. Expert airmen possess discipline, skill, and proficiency. Expert airmen have a thorough understanding of themselves, their aircraft, their team, their environment, and the risk they face. Expert airmen consistently display situational awareness and use of good judgment at all times. Can we agree on this definition of airmanship? And if you agree, please raise your hand. Hit that little button. Good. Well, most of you agree, a couple of you don't, but most of you agree on that shared definition. Well, this is the definition then that we're going to use to talk about all of this airmanship development techniques and processes and procedures. Let's take a look at Kern's airmanship model. This is out of his book. There are three bedrock principles in the Kern airmanship model: discipline, skill, and proficiency. And then upon those bedrock principles are 5 pillars of knowledge: knowledge of self, aircraft, team, environment, and risk. And upon those 5 pillars of knowledge rest the capstone outcomes that we're looking for of increased situational awareness and good judgment. Let me come at that one more time in a little different way. If we practice the bedrock principles of discipline, skill, and proficiency while always striving for perfect knowledge of self, aircraft, team, environment, and risk, we can expect ever-improving capstone outcomes of situational awareness and judgment. Now in Session 1, we're going to talk primarily about the bedrock principles of discipline, skill, and proficiency. Then in Session 2, we'll talk about the pillars of knowledge, and in Session 3, we'll talk about the capstone outcomes. And then the final 3 sessions of the webinar series, we'll talk about your personal airmanship development plan, safety management systems, safety cultures, and a few more things. So let's start by looking at discipline. Here's some personal views on discipline. Lieutenant Colonel Eileen Collins, who was a shuttle astronaut, says that the need for a disciplined approach to airmanship exists at all levels of flying. Captain John Cook, Concorde pilot, says in order to have the freedom of flight, you must have the discipline. Discipline prevents crashes. Flight discipline, as defined by Kern, is the ability and willpower to safely employ an aircraft within operational, regulatory, organizational, and common sense guidelines, unless an emergency demands otherwise. There's your PIC authority. Discipline is a sacred trust. Pilots enjoy considerable freedom of action with which to address in-flight events. Airmen are given a sacred trust not to take advantage of a system designed to allow flexibility and creativity. Because of this sacred trust, flight discipline must be the foundation of an aviator's airmanship package. And that's why Kern put it as the first bedrock principle, discipline. Let's look at skill. Personal view by Winston Churchill. There comes a time in every man's life that he is called upon to do something very special, like maybe handle an engine fire, for which he and only he has the capabilities, the skills, and has the necessary training. And if you get in that situation, you hope you do have all of those things. What a pity if the moment finds the man unprepared. Here's another personal view. Brigadier General Chuck Yeager. Now, I'm sure you all know who he is. He was first man to break the speed barrier and many other things. And Yeager says, complacency will kill the best of pilots. Know your aircraft, especially the parts of it that can save your life. Seek to improve yourself. That's the mark of a true professional. And here's Yeager's answer to that question I posed earlier. If you are going to fly, do it right. Don't forget, Murphy is watching and waiting for the unprepared. Skill building. We have to build those skills. Flying requires multiple skills that are developed in and out of formal training. In addition to physical flying skills, excellent airmanship requires excellent communication skills, decision-making skills, team skills, and self-assessment skills. Those are the important. That self-assessment skills are really important, and but they are skills. You can learn how to self-assess properly. Still talking about skill building. Logical risk assessment requires an airman to have the skill to assess current talents and proficiency, seek appropriate training as required. All of the above skills must be built by all pilots who desire to achieve high levels of airmanship. Traditional flight training programs build to a predetermined minimum skill level for safe operations, and that's the way it's designed, and that's okay. Nothing wrong with that, but they only take you up to that minimum level of skill for safe operations to pass that check ride. Then they turn you loose into your flying environment, and you need more skill than just those minimum skills for safety. Typical recurrent training only checks for a minimum level of proficiency. These requirements are designed to keep you safe, not necessarily to help you reach your potential as an aviator. Individual excellence requires you to personally manage your own airmanship development. Airmanship excellence requires you to seek continuous improvement based on a rigorous evaluations of your strengths and weaknesses. There are 4 levels of skill: safety, effectiveness, efficiency, and precision. Let's take a little closer look at those. Level 1, safety. The first level of skill is reached, at least temporarily, by all pilots who check out in an aircraft. Level 2, effectiveness. The second level of skill comes about when we achieve a basic mastery of the activities required to perform our flying duties. So effectiveness. Then level 3, efficiency. Efficiency requires that you learn techniques as well as procedures. So to be efficient, you know how to learn your lean your engine properly, or you have to know how to call up a direct to a waypoint in your GPS to cut a corner, save some fuel. So efficiency requires you learn techniques as well as procedures. Level 4, precision and continuous improvement. This final level of airmanship skill is characterized by the few aviators who constantly seek greater precision. I don't see this much in personal flying and general aviation. Maybe some of you are that disciplined that you're always working at this. You're trying to get better all the time, more precise all the time, and I applaud you if you're doing that. But at the airlines, we did it all the time, and I think there are a couple of reasons for that, but the main reason was peer pressure. We were always flying with another pilot, and so we were always egging each other on to do better, put that jet down right on the touchdown point, do it smoothly, be precise in our estimates, be precise in our flying. So we had someone there to kind of help us to do that. And we don't have that in personal flying just yet, although later on we're going to talk about how we can introduce that to personal flying. This level of skill requires maturity and consistent and honest self-appraisal. Few aviators ever reach this level. And when they do, they have to strive to stay there. You don't reach the level and then lay back on your laurels. You have to keep working at it. Aviators are required to periodically meet certain minimum standards to pass evaluations and legally operate an aircraft. Once these standards are met, the drive to continue to improve skills often diminishes. I think you can all, if you're doing an honest evaluation of yourself, will admit to that. Some are simply satisfied to get a pilot's license. Their goal has been met when they pass the check ride. And I've talked to thousands of pilots over the years that fit in that category. So their motivation to improve is gone, and that's something that we think we can reintroduce here with airmanship development, formalized programs of airmanship development to motivate people to improve. Competing demands for your time can cause study habits to be directed to other interests, and that's probably the biggest factor in people not pursuing continuous airmanship development. I just was chatting yesterday evening with a guy that had been flying for a long time, and about 3 or 4 years ago he just stopped flying, although he still pays his dues to his flying club even though he doesn't fly. And I asked him why. He said, well, I've got to do this, I'm building a new this, I've got to do that, the family this, and that's all true. But those other factors were there when we started to learn to fly. So it's a matter of priorities, we all know that. Whatever the reason, it is an unfortunate fact that once a certain skill level is reached, many aviators stop improving. Kern says when you stop improving your airmanship skills, you have airmanship paralysis. And I think that's a good term that we all ought to think about for a minute. Are we or are we not right now in airmanship paralysis? All right, let's look at proficiency, the last bedrock principle. It is no secret that experience builds airmanship skills and that recent experience accounts for proficiency. Research has found that pilots with less than 500 hours in model, and most of us in personal flying have less than 500 hours in a particular model of airplane we're flying, that we're at a significantly greater risk for pilot error mishap factors. Research has also shown that pilots with less than 10 flight hours in 30 days, 10 hours a month, were found to be at far greater risk than those with 10 to 30 hours. And in fact, that study that's cited here, 30 hours was the optimum, 30 hours a month. And when you go over 30 hours, they found that proficiency started falling off for reasons like fatigue, complacency, and so forth. So that 10 to 30 hours is the sweet spot. We believe that a minimum in personal flying under very controlled conditions, 4 to 5 hours a month is really a minimum. If you're not flying that much, you shouldn't be flying at all, or if you haven't been flying that much, you need some recurrent training. Remember, just because it's legal doesn't mean that it's safe. Just because it's legal to go out and fly if you've had 3 takeoffs and landings in the last 90 days doesn't mean necessarily that that is safe for you to do. Flight skill loss occurs rapidly. And I'm sure you've all seen this graphic before. It's in most of the pilot training books. But the bottom red area shows pilot workload at the different phases of flight. And the level of pilot capabilities, or we could call that airmanship. What's your level of airmanship? You can see that defines your capabilities throughout the different phases of flight. And that difference between the workload and your capabilities is the safety margin. You can think of that as your reserve fuel. And flight skill loss decreases the safety margin. As your level of capability comes down, gets closer to the workload, you don't have much of a safety margin. And in a high task load situations like landing, you don't have much margin to begin with. So if you don't maintain your proficiencies on landing, then you might not, that workload might even exceed your capabilities, and that's where you have an incident or accident. And in fact, takeoff and landing accidents are the highest accident category in general aviation. Pilots are not good at assessing their own proficiency in specific flight tests. That's been proven through research. The greatest skill loss occurs in the least desirable areas, like landings, traffic pattern operations, accelerated stalls, crosswind landings, crosswind takeoffs, minimum control airspeed, and steep turns. So the skills that we need the most are the areas that we lose those skills most rapidly. So in this session, we've covered the bedrock principles of discipline, skill, and proficiency. Next time, we're going to talk about the 5 pillars of knowledge, and then we'll get into situational awareness and judgment. So here's a final perspective. This both comes out of Kern's book and my opinions. Pilots come in many different types and degrees of airmanship proficiency. We fly different aircraft types. We fly in many different locations. We fly for different reasons, professionally, personal flying. But regardless of what background we bring to aviation, what aircraft type we fly, or why we fly, we all have a moral responsibility to each other, our passengers, and the public to practice sound, fundamental airmanship. We all must take a stand against poor airmanship at the only point at which we have total control. That's ourselves. The standards suggested by Kern's airmanship model represent characteristics and traits of successful airmen since the dawn of time. The essence of what it means to be an airman cannot fall by the wayside. We need a shared sense of who we are and what we stand for. The common structure and language suggested in Redefining Airmanship provide an excellent framework for airmanship development. At this point in the seminar series, are you ready to answer the question, and this is rhetorical still at this point, if I don't fly right, should I fly at all? So I'd like to ask you to think about that after the seminar and give it some serious thought. Well, the next steps are obviously yours. My suggestions are, for next steps, complete the Redefining Airmanship webinar series, because we've just looked at the tip of the iceberg here in this session today. Read the book, Redefining Airmanship. Amazon carries it, and probably other sources. Get in the airmanship loop. Go to the Center for Airmanship Excellence website, plug in there so you're getting information about airmanship, finding out about events and other resources that are available to you to develop your airmanship, and commit to a continuous airmanship development plan. So I'd like to ask you another couple of questions here, how this seminar or webinar went for you, and let me hang on just one second, and I will call up the polls. All right, was this webinar helpful to you? Did you get something out of it? Is it making you think about developing airmanship? Well, great. All of you say that it was helpful. And I have one final question. Do you plan on attending the next webinar? Well, great. All of you plan on attending the next webinar. That's great. Do you have any questions or comments? So now's the time. If you have questions, go ahead and either type them in or raise your hand. Either way will work. If I see that your hand is raised. Oh. Stand by. There we go. Okay, John Munson I see has his hand raised. John, I'm opening up your mic. Do you have a question or comment? No, nothing from John. How about Ken Stone? Okay.
Hello?
Hey, there you are. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm just questioning the effectiveness of hitting us with a lot of negative statistics and then at the same time telling us that airmanship is being affected negatively at the same time. I need to have more positive feedback. Is that what we're going to get in the next series?
Well, yeah, there'll be a lot more positive feedback, but let me just touch on that again, Ken, since there seemed to be a little confusion. This is Ken, is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. You know, the reason we show you those statistics is to show data, not just opinion, that something needs to be done. Things that have been done over the last few decades aren't working. However, over in the other sections of the industry, airlines, military, charter flying, things have been done that have been effective. And those things are primarily airmanship development issues. So that's why we start with that, to establish the fact that we all need to look at doing something to improve things. And then now we're looking at what those things are. That's airmanship development.
And that's what we're going to get in the rest of the series then?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome. Any other questions? Okay, Julie, I see your hands raised, but did you have you have a question or comment?
No, I don't. I thought it was very useful information. I appreciated the part where you talked about the period of time in between getting your VFR and IFR, that there's a lot we can do to create for ourselves new challenges and new goals to be established.
That's very true. And in fact, we are going to show you later how we are working on a system, a program, an organization that will actually work with you to do that. I'll give you one example. Let's say you've just gotten your private license, and you're thinking, well, my next step is that instrument rating, but boy, that's a huge step. It takes a lot of time and money and effort to get there. But I want to get better because I know that I just know the basics now that I got my private. Well, there are things like stall spin course, tail dragger checkout, doing some of the instrument training just so that you can get yourself out of trouble, learning glass cockpits. I mean, there are many, many, many smaller steps between private and instrument rating, as an example, that can be laid out for you that you can just step through and get recognized for and get, if you will, privileges for by attaining those goals. So I'm glad you see that. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you.
Well, great. If there are any other questions, let me just scroll up here and see. Here we go. Alan, I see your hand is up. Do you have a comment? Alan?
Hello?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
Just comment was just that a lot of statistics you presented to this are not new. We've seen them through the years. So I think the challenge here, of course, was taking personal responsibility for our own airmanship and the improvement of that.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you for that comment, Alan. You're exactly right. And, you know, I agree with you. We've all seen those statistics, but there hasn't been any change. So that's why we go through them so that we're all on the same page starting out, that I think you would agree with me, all of you, that we need to do something. What has been done hasn't been working. So, well, great. Thank you again for attending. And the FAA is sending out emails with the registration information for the next webinars. However, the webinars are brand new to the FAA. They've only done a few others before we started this series. And it's kind of a cumbersome system. Some mistakes have been made. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send an email to all of you with the proper link for Session 2. And of course, just like Session 1, we're holding Session 2 on 2 different times, Monday evening at 7 p.m. and Saturday morning at 10. So tomorrow I'll send you all that email with the proper registration links. So disregard any emails you get from the FAA. I know the one for next Monday night Session 2 has the wrong link in it, so I'll send you the right link. Well, thank you once again for attending. I'm looking forward to working with you in Session 2.
Great. Thank you, David.
You're welcome.